For more on this, we spoke with Dr. Stuart Sumida and Dr. Elizabeth Rega, who are both scientists and who consult for films. We're sitting down with Dr. Elizabeth Rega, medical school professor at Western University of Health Sciences, and Dr. Stuart Sumida, biology professor at California State University, San Bernardino, about scientific consulting in films. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Let's start out with sort of a straightforward question. Can you tell us how you became scientific consultants? And Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Oh, well, goodness. I mean, how we became scientific consultants. I think this goes back to a significant friend and colleague of Stuart's and mine, Charles Solomon, who was with Stuart at UCLA. And my recollection is that the Disney studios really needed some help with their horses on Beauty and the Beast, which is Stuart's project, his first project with the studios. And the antecedent to that was Charles Solomon suggested, well, no one's left in the studios. All of the, what they called the 9 old men were gone. And so Charles had suggested, why not get an anatomist? Why not get a scientist? And they brought Stuart in, who was wildly successful on helping with a big draft horse. And then close on the heels came Lion King. And I believe, Stuart, this is where your story kind of hooks into how I got in.
That's right. The original project was, we thought, a one-off until Beauty and the Beast did so well. And then they said, well, you know, the next film's going to have all animals in it. But the film that had all animals in that, Lion King, included a primate, which was, at the time, a knuckle-walking baboon. And we're like, time out. And at that point, Elizabeth came in and helped James Baxter, who is a tremendous animator. He sort out the behavior and posture and a variety of other features of the character that became known as Rafiki. And so we actually got to work on that together, which was a lot of fun. And then after that came Pocahontas, in which Beth spent an enormous amount of time talking about both anatomical and cultural features. And I got to spend a little bit of time on some of the animals. But then over the years, we were perceived as a sort of a part of the recipe to help make characters look better and move more smoothly and more realistically. It would probably be fair to say that I mostly work on animals and occasionally dip my toe into talking about people, whereas Beth does an enormous amount of time on people and primates, including fossil people, but still does work on animals. In fact, she teaches comparative anatomy as well as human anatomy.
So at what point do you get called in? Do you called in during the planning phases of these films, or do the filmmakers get to the certain point where they're trying to create a character and then sort of panic a little bit and call in you guys as experts?
Well, as academics, I believe the answer is E, all of the above, depending on the project.
Fair.
We can tell you that it is best if they have us in early. It really is. There are some times when they simply want someone to come in and tell them, yeah, that looks great, and they hope that we say that. And it's not always the case, but in general, the best time to be in is early in the planning stages where we're doing character design and we're training the artists for how to make them move and how to get them to act on screen.
Yeah, artist education is one of the best places to make sure that they're starting on a good basis. But it really depends on where we're going. We're not the science police. And that is one of the reasons why we're popular with the studios is I've been in a film project that had a very prominent famous actor in it where, technically we had to put reference points on him physically and film him in the kind of pre-performance capture days. Right. And then create a gorilla that was retrofitted from a human rig, which was a delightful science experiment because it was so easy to do in a day. and then have to take this beautiful rig and make it worse because it didn't match the gorilla costume that they'd already filmed, right? And if that's the kind of business that makes you a crazy person, then you're not right for the film industry, because you've got to take folks where they're at. And one of the really great things about working with animators as behind the scenes people is telling them the way it really is usually makes their life easier, not harder. Right? There's that anecdote that we have from even Mulan, which I think for both of us is just a highlight of our career, where, looking at the computer rigs of the ponies as they're galloping down in the snow, and they couldn't make them look right, and they were trying to achieve something that hadn't been done. And right when they open the rig, you're looking over their shoulder and going, oh, well, attach the pelvis and detach the scapula. And they thought it was magic, right? All of a sudden, all of their problems were solved by simply making the rig reflect the biological reality, which is kind of that perfect moment that you have as a scientist when you're working with media. What do you think, Stuart?
Yeah, well, and Beth brings up a couple of important points. When people think of animation, they think of what they see on the outer surface of a character. And back in when we first started doing this kind of thing, that's really what you did. You talked to people who drew things, and you told them what they should look like on a piece of paper. The pipeline is much more complicated now. Everybody thinks that computer animation makes things faster and easier. It doesn't. It just gives you more options. And there are many, many more stages to this, which includes modeling, design, then what Beth just mentioned, rigging, which is putting an internal, essentially marionette-like skeleton in the side of the character so the animators can move it. And that really, for us as paleontologists, is priceless, because the best analog for an internal skeleton is a skeleton, right? And so we used to spend tons of time doing surface anatomy, and we still do. But now we spend an enormous amount of time on joint biomechanics, which is great. And so what happens then is it lets you look inside of characters into their, for want of a better term, their animation anatomy, and help them get things to move in a way that hopefully will feel comfortable on screen. But that really reflects the fact that we're scientists first, we're anatomists first. And because we are into skeletons, we're into bones and joint mechanics, and then of course the way the muscles make them move, that puts us in a very, very good position to help the animators do what they want to do. But to be fair, as Beth said, we know we're not making documentaries. We know mice don't really talk. We get that.
Yeah. But if they did talk, how would their little facial muscles make their mouth move? Because that's part of overcoming. A lot of folks talk about the uncanny valley. And honestly, that discourse was so overblown, because the uncanny valley is just code for I don't know how to animate eye movement. Right. And one of the things we found that goes right to our own neurobiology as primates is that we are intensely visual. And our visual cortex is so much of a part of our emotional state and social hierarchy that, the studios know and leverage that without having that terminology to affix to it. In our business, it's like, okay, how do we advocate for making things look good, making things look plausible, whether it's a hyper-realistic situation or whether you have to make a hadrosaur talk, right? And in which case, and it's one of our favorite anecdotes from Dinosaur, which was Disney's first foray into digital animation, is that they had an animated, an accurate hadrosaur, and the people working on that project were incredibly accurate illustrators, experts in the field like David Krentz. And, when they tested it, having a beak on a hadrosaur made it look like, and they quote, two clacking coconuts, right? So that would have been a realistic hadrosaur. So you go back to the drawing board and go, okay, hadrosaurs don't have front teeth, but if they did, How would they look? And they don't have muscles of facial expression. We know reptiles don't, including birds. But if they did have muscles of facial expression, where would they attach and how would they move? So, that's where you're kind of marrying art and science. If we can get past the fact that hadrosaurs had to talk, right? And then that's just one of the conceits or constraints. And so this is where I caution, both folks that are making their living in the attention economy, is that it may be fun kind of as a one-off to make fun of the inaccuracies in the films. But that kind of makes you come off as Grandpa Simpson, kind of shaking your fist at those kids on your lawn. I think the alternative that I hope has kept both Stuart and I relevant is that it's always a dialogue and a discourse, and it is kind of that essay into the possibilities, which really led us into Strange World, which was the perfect point for us to start a project, wasn't it? Because
it really was. It was at the front end when ideas were being batted around. And so to circle all the way back to your question, it is really useful for us to be there at the very, very front end of things. And I can say that with some minor exceptions, most of the projects where we've actually had, I think, the most useful impact have been those where we've been on the project early on.
Yeah, like right at the very beginning, teaching Disney animators how to knuckle walk in the studio right down there in Burbank. I mean, that was, great. And really some of our lasting value, I think, that has stuck with the industry almost the most is the work we put on Mulan. Particularly from my end of things with their central question of how do you make a woman dressed as a man read as both in a film where it's not about a princess, her mom is alive, her grandmother is alive, she's defending family honor in a real crisis. This was a departure for the studio, not only in terms of theme and gender, but an enormous step for them in trying to depict accurately people of different population subgroups. And this is, what does a Chinese skull like? What does it mean to be Chinese? And we had a lot of, we had a lot of undoing within the studios with the artists as our advocates to make this work, because the producers had a vision that, in a way we were like, that's like putting, Asian eyes on a Barbie doll head. You're not being complete about it. And the fact of the matter is that there are significant differences in skull shape that affect face shape, that affect facial expression. And unless we got them to recognize and make those skulls not European, it wasn't going to succeed as a film. And there are many other aspects where maybe that consistency didn't succeed. And I'm thinking of the costumes here. So for anyone out there that's like concerned about the costumes, I echo their concerns about those. But when it comes to the physiognomy, it was revolutionary. And we worked with Ruben Aquino, an amazing animator who had done so many things. Shang on this one, I believe, and then Powhatan on Pocahontas. And he is a Filipino American. And as a Filipino,
part Okinawan as well.
Yeah, and was partly our advocate. And we felt just like getting Rafiki not to knuckle walk. Getting Mulan and Shang to have accurate shaped heads and faces changed the way the studio engaged that variation that a lot of people call race, but really we know as scientists is just, your population subgroup, contingent on how people perceive that. And before then, the studio had been trying hard. They tried hard at Pocahontas to less success, I think, in everybody's view, but it was part of that inflection point, I think, really in the studios. They talk about the golden age, and for us, that was the golden age of really educating their animators and educating their producers. And now you see the diversity of characters that they animate, and they don't have to go to their go-to diversity people. That's already baked in.
Yeah,
and that brings us back to Strange World.
part of making sure that these subgroups are accurately portrayed is what ultimately will make the film more believable and more engaging. So it's a really important aspect to sort of get right.
It is, and the good news is that studios are recognizing this. It's not just Disney, but a variety of studios are recognizing this as well. There's a very much an analogous example in video games. The original designs of the characters in the video game Horizon Zero Dawn pretty much looked like Barbie dolls, and even though we spent a lot of time talking about dinosaurs and making robotic analogs for dinosaurs and things like that, the amount of time that they were convinced to spend looking at proper female versus male anatomy really made the heroine in that game one of the most popular ones we now have. I would argue that the video game industry is also beginning to learn some of those lessons a little later than the film industry. But the great news is that media understands that if you represent people in a way that others can relate to, it's going to work, and people are going to engage when they see themselves on screen.
Yeah, representation matters is the ultimate lesson.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you look at the dates of those films, when you look back at the heyday, and that's early 90s, I do feel with some pride now looking back on the career and what Stuart and I have both been able to do with Disney, but also with other studios. The fact that this is not something that you have to spend a half an hour introducing variation and representation and why it matters, everyone knows that now. And when everyone knows it, I feel like you've succeeded as somebody that was an early torchbearer for getting the studios to be accurate to the degree to which was going to assist in representation and to really look at the world around them. And nobody is a better ally for that than artists, because you guide them and they help be our allies. And I think that's how we succeeded within the industry, is regarding the artists as our allies and understanding what their audience was and not policing their science outside the scope of the project.
And there are many different approaches. I mean, so the example that Beth gave with Mulan are stylized characters. They're animated after all, and they weren't hand drawn. So stylized, but doing very realistic behaviors, right down to choreography for the horses running in the martial arts. Okay, sometimes you have very cartoony characters doing what might be otherwise realistic behaviors, and so you have to then be able to switch gears and talk about realism, even when something like Scooby-Doo is going to do it. And occasionally you have hyper-realistic, photorealistic representation. That's one of the toughest things to do, because everybody has their own image of how Scooby-Doo moves, but everybody knows how their cat moves, even if they can't quantify it. So if you talk about films like Life of Pi, where everything was photorealistic, or some of these strictly human photorealistic projects that Beth's worked on, that is actually when you have to really sometimes get into nitty gritty stuff. And I know, for example, Beth's even brought artists into her anatomy lab, her gross anatomy lab, which is always entertaining to see, by the way. I love bringing artists into the labs, both for animals and people.
Well, it really underscores, when you bring artists in the lab, it underscores where science and art really do intersect. Artists want to know how things work. They want to connect the dots. They want to show realism. And I think, for us as musculoskeletal biologists, it's one of the easiest ways to bring that to the artistic community, because they so clearly intersect.
Do you find that artists follow the same sort of steps that we do as paleontologists or anthropologists, in that we sort of start with bones and joints and then add on muscles and organs and skin? Do they follow a similar process in creating these characters, or do they have their own unique process?
Many do. Some of the finest artists we know sketch out not always intensely realistic skeletons, but approximately proportionally realistic skeletal structures. They put on muscles, and one of the things that we really try to engage them with is to remind them that the skin doesn't just come to the bones, right? On top of the bones, you have muscle, fat, skin, sometimes fur, or other ornament, and so on. And I can tell you that some of the finest artists we know at a variety of different studios start out with skeletal structures. I have this one image that I really love. We worked on a project called Bolt, which is about a dog, and there's a really remarkable artist that worked with Disney named Jin Kim, and Jin built Bolt's skeleton, then he built his muscles, then he put on his fur, and at the same time I was reviewing doing a book review by Mauricio Antone, who does exactly the same thing with fossil mammal carnivores, and I showed the book to Jin, and Jin was like, because I love this man, I don't even know him, but I love him, because they're doing exactly the same thing. So, and in fact, one of the reasons paleontologists get along with animators so well is exactly your point. There is an enormous overlap in the strategies that we have when we try and understand what we do. We try and communicate life of the past by rebuilding it, and animators are communicating by building characters in very analogous manners.
Yeah, when you talk about bringing something to life, the approach that Stuart talks about used to be some of your top animators would come down and kind of do the muscles underneath. But now the technology of rigging has now dictated that really everyone has to do that. So it's gone from a nice to have to a need to have. And so, yes, being brought in earlier is quite helpful. We have to keep in mind that when artists are developing art, they're often looking at shadows in a stylistic two-dimension sense. So, the shape of the animal can kind of be a challenge. And I know you've had spherical animals that you've had to sketch a skeleton into, right? It's not like the sky's the limit. Oftentimes they will be looking at a profile in both 2 and 3 dimensions that they're looking to fill. And part of our job is to help them troubleshoot the motion, given the stylistic choices they've been required to make.
Can you tell us more about the sphere with a skeleton?
So you had asked earlier if we work just with Disney. We have worked extensively with Disney, but we work with a variety of other studios as well. One of them, which is DreamWorks, and DreamWorks Animation did a film a few years ago, which was originally to be called Everest, then called Abominable, which was about essentially a Yeti, an abominable snowman type of character. And the way he was originally conceived was almost spherical, so that he could move in any direction at will. And so that was one of the story themes behind his behavior, which made it, which gave the writers all sorts of fun opportunities, but it made the animators and riggers nuts, because you had this thing where they couldn't figure out, how should we base it? Does it have 4 limbs that are all the same that can go in any direction? Does it have 4 limbs and hind limbs? And in the end, we wound up making the head bigger and and sort of the limbs stubbier, so he would have a spherical outline, but he still needed arms and legs. And the director's like, he can't be a gorilla. He can't be a gorilla. And so we literally had to build a mythical skeleton into a mythical beast, but it was still a mammal, right? So he had a pretty weird head, but he also had human facial muscles because he had to express. So we know that those kinds of characters don't exist, but if they did, right? So it becomes an exercise, right? These are the kinds of exercises that we give to our students in comparative anatomy. We give them a mythical beast and they say, now, what would its skeleton look like? Like maybe it's a centaur or something like that. Well, would you know what a horse looks like? And do you know what a bird looks like? Or do you know what a horse and a human look like? Or things like that. And so they're just doing it at a very, very, very sophisticated level. And so yeah, but spheres are tough. Spheres are tough. I like things that have longer legs myself. So.
So you've both been alluding to Strange Worlds, the new Disney film. Would you like to talk a little bit more about your own role in helping design some of these very, very interesting and cool life forms?
Well, I would want to preface that by saying Strange World is something where for us was a strange project.
Indeed.
And the reason it was a strange project, as we alluded to, is that Stuart and I can be brought in by the studios at various stages in their development of usually the animation, sometimes the story, sometimes, unfortunately, simultaneously, animation at the same time the story is written. But this project was unique in that we were brought in by Don Hall at the conception, at the very beginning, the genesis of this is what we're looking for, kind of. We think maybe, will you come in as a part of a team of scientists and basically brainstorm with us? And it was a kind of, they'd come in with questions. We were in their, their war room, essentially, their kind of secret chamber of images. That's controlled access, that they're putting ideas up there. And then I would say up and down the scale of microscopic to macroscopic,
yeah.
It was a big session of Stump the Scientist. And and one of the things that as a scientist, I'm sure that and as a paleontologist, I'm sure that you live, is that truth is stranger than fiction, right? The actual science of knowing deep time or microscopic anatomy and physiology, you don't need science fiction. Science truth is crazy enough. And so that is where they were keen to intersect the project, by playing with these issues of scale, and creating that kind of central mystery. Once you kind of know the twist, and we don't want to be spoilers for this, although I think by the time that you're airing, this will be in broader release. But it really does, once you look at it a second or third time, then you'll see exactly what scientific systems were referenced. And that meant working with animators to explain, either geological or microscopic concepts without putting too much jargon into them. And I really can't stress that enough, is that, the formula for our success has been interacting with these folks without using too much jargon.
And if you take a look at the film, there are analogs to ecologies, from the ecology of a single organism being an ecological system, to ecosystems around the world, and both living and fossil. Without giving too much away, much of the imagery that you will see in this film is a sort of a mashup of the internal biology of an organism represented as an ecosystem with things as varied as Ediacaran faunas. When we got to go to the premiere, and I was like, I can see hallucigenia, I can see Dickinsonia, I can see all of these different creatures. We could see blood cells, we could see vessels, we could see trachea, and which kind of was it an insect trachea, or was it a respiratory system of a vertebrate? Well, it was not either, but it was inspired by. Mm-hmm. And so the opportunity to just bat those ideas around was as Beth said, a really unique example for us. Sometimes we're literally biomechanists for them. Yeah. But in this case, we were conceptual scientists for them, which was super, super fun.
Yeah, and the exciting adventure when you have animators discovering alveoli. Well, what's an alveolus? Well, let's talk about scale and diffusion and why things can't be big. You're really drilling down, and there were other scientists with us, some of whom were physicists, some were physiologists. And, it was about creating that entire world top to bottom, basing it on processes, analogs that you see in the natural world, so that there would be that kind of, I think, depth of beauty. And do appreciate that like paleontologists, there's really a substantial kind of nerd component within the animation community.
Yeah.
And all things being equal, creative people would much rather know the cool stuff and leverage it than necessarily have to go out there on a rope. It helped it cohere. So I think, a very satisfying project, but it was also very different because I think what you said is, how did we help design the characters? For the first time, we didn't.
Yeah.
For the first time, I think, in any project, we put no skeleton in anything. As a matter of fact, many of the skeletons, as Stuart had pointed out once, are hydrostatic skeletons.
That's right. We explained what a hydrostat was. We explained what a muscular hydrostat was, and then they ran with it.
Yeah. Or even the cellular hydrostat, and talked about, the fact that even cells have a cytoskeleton. But then it goes to, what do you do with multicellular organisms like a slime mold, and how do they move, and what is there? Or how does a macrophage attach to the inside, the epithelium of a blood vessel, and then migrate through that epithelium into the interstitial space? All of those are things that you don't normally have conversations with animators about. Unless you're working with something, that's very specifically focused on that. And so many of your folks will have seen Osmosis Jones. And yes, Stuart and I worked together on Osmosis Jones in almost the similar capacity of helping brainstorm.
Yeah.
So, this is, I think, a very satisfying film, and it's going to be satisfying on a whole bunch of different levels. Maybe even for the same audience. And so not only in that science perspective, but you could ask me, I think, what my 15-year-old son's reaction to this was. And I will tell you, as an anthropologist, I was delighted. I had to be cool, though. I couldn't be too delighted because he is 15.
Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting, of course, is that as Beth said, the artists, there's a significant nerd factor going on here, and I say that in only the most charitable of manners. And so you will appreciate that there are, for biologists and paleontologists, there are tons of Easter eggs in this film. Okay, all you have to do is just watch the film and see which characters might have inspired, or which systems might have inspired. And it goes, as Beth said, all the way from the subcellular level, all the way on up to to evolutionary scale. For example, and this is a pretty blatant Easter egg, the name of the family that are the protagonists in the film are the clades, for cladogram, of course. For a family of related organisms. And when we pointed out to them what a cladogram was, they lost their minds. And then they told us, oh yeah, we're going to name them the clades. I lost my mind. And so it was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun.
And the biological variation of the human beings there is just a matter of fact now. They don't need people to come in and help them talk about human diversity. That was an assumption. And so the family is pretty diverse. And it's not a thing, right? The family is diverse. It just is. Yeah. And it's not part of the plot, right? It takes a lot of variation across the human spectrum, and both displays it, but doesn't kind of make it part of the conflict. It's just kind of, in a sense, I think that is my favorite thing about it is that it brings it out there in a way that excites that kind of identity that I haven't seen since Mulan. But that project had legs. And when I asked my students to raise hands, how many of you have seen X? nearly all of them have still seen Mulan, and for most of the women, that is still one of their favorite films, for all of the reasons that we know that make those things satisfying, when we can relate to something other than being a princess, right? And to accomplishment and challenge and frankly growth, right? Growth in your own abilities, but growth in your ability to work with people. It was an exciting project, and I think for us in animation, there is an eternalness to animation that some projects may not have done spectacularly well in the cinemas to start, but had critical legs. And I'm thinking Iron Giant, a real classic, or, even within the Disney canon, I would look at Treasure Planet, some really remarkable things going on in that. And even Emperor's New Groove, which when we started working on it was Kingdom of the Sun, and it was going to be a photorealistic, and we had to get the Inca correct. Now it moved to comedy, but if you take a look at it and understand all of the history and physiognomy that we went through, it is recognizably Incan. It is not Aztec. They didn't make that mistake. And when you look at the features of the people, all of those lectures on skull anatomy didn't go amiss. Those were incorporated into the designs, and yet that is a highly comic kind of romp with some of the best characters, and the best characterization of Eartha Kitt, really, to have captured her in art and voice in that role. All of those are things that if your audience isn't familiar with Disney animation and they think it's just kind of, homogenized family pablum, there are some really exciting and interesting projects out there. And I'm going to suggest that Strange World is certainly one of those.
I mean, every movie you just listed is like definitive of my whole childhood and adolescence. So I'm sure if it's anything like historically what Disney has put out, that it will be amazing.
Yeah. Well, you see, as scientists, why we're so excited to hear that. I mean, we're fundamentally educators. We're both taking time away from our grading to talk with you. And these are the films that have educated a generation, and we haven't called it science, and yet it's there.
Final question in a few seconds or less. Which of all the projects you each have done, which has been your favorite?
Oh, goodness. Do you want to go first?
Well, I'm going to say Mulan, right? And Mulan because it's not only that specific project, trying to get accuracy of physiognomy. It was the time period in the studio and the people we were working with. I think it transformed their approach.
I will have to agree with Beth on that for different reasons. I've been doing martial arts since I was a young pup, and we got to do not only animals, but people and martial arts. I mean, animation, martial arts, and anatomy. How happy could I be, right? And not only that she got to go in the end and she got to kick ass, all right? So that was great. But I can tell you that I have an enormous soft spot from the very first big film I ever worked on, which was Lion King. And there are some beauties out there. There's some stinkers. Okay, I'm quite proud of the work we did on Ratatouille with Pixar, and on Life of Pi. I thought that was some work done by some remarkable artists at Rhythm and Hughes that doesn't always get the credit it gets. So it should. It doesn't always get the credit it should. And I remain very excited about what's to come with Strange World.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today, and we'll see you next time on Science on the Street.